we understand that we are the chosen priesthood, the called out nation, and it happened at Passover. It's the marriage ordination. Passover is the covenant confirming meal. We sit down together and we have a common meal. We really actually do have common union together. And how often do we have communion? Once a year, as often as you would celebrate the Passover. So this truly is communion, once a year, not what goes on in the traditional institutionalized church, which comes from somewhere else in Rome, down by the Tiber River. So we can find that we know that this Passover, the Lamb of Yahweh, was truly a substitute for a substitute, right? Because that substitute in Exodus 12, that physical lamb, that body and that blood was ultimately pointing to Yahusha. And we know that that bread and wine that we're going to partake of today truly is the real meat, is it not? But we know back in the Torah that Yahweh said thus, Israel, Israel, my firstborn son, let him go so he can worship me. So Israel was what? Positionally, Yahweh's firstborn son. Yet, because of transgression, there was a later replacement of the firstborn son for the tribe of Levi, right? Replace the firstborn. So if we're going to get back to the original, Yahweh's perfect will, then we need to be restored as the what? The firstborn, which would also mean that there would be a transference of priesthood, would it not? You see, this is the life and the realm of scriptural reality that we are all now accustomed to, which is foreign to those in the nations or the institutionalized church, because this is the meat. This is the true meat of the Passover, not a thimble and a cracker, but it is so much more. In Shemot, Exodus chapter 12, we find that this is the only Melchizedek Passover in the entire Bible. Exodus chapter 12 is the only Melchizedek Passover in the entire Bible, except, of course, for the Passover of Yahusha, when he officiates as the Melchizedek high priest, initiating and ratifying the Melchizedek new covenant as Jeremiah prophesied in the 31st chapter. So Melchizedek is first made known to us in Bereshit, Genesis chapter 14. Hebrews chapter 7 verse 3 reveals that the Melchizedek order is eternal. Israel, we know, broke the book of the covenant and they lost their Melchizedek standing and they were placed under the Levitical or the Aaronic priesthood. They lost their firstborn status and it was given to the sons of Aaron. And at that time, the Levitical priesthood reigned under the book of the law until Yahusha comes at Passover and restores the Melchizedek priesthood. He ratifies the Melchizedek new covenant at his death at this Passover, the crucifixion, and then Yahusha being freed from the book of the law by his death becomes our Melchizedek high priest. You couldn't make this up, even if you wanted to. I mean, it's everywhere. And it is, like I said last night, the veins of Scripture. It just, the pumping throughout. But Passover does not actually begin, as we have been led to believe, in Exodus Shemot chapter 12. It began before then. Let's go to Bereshit, Genesis chapter 15. Verse 13, and he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, And they shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. So 400 years from this promise, they are going to find their redemption. In the 16th verse, it says, but in the fourth generation, they shall come hither again. So we know that there is this timing of redemption. And ultimately, it leads to Yahushua. And we know at that Passover supper, just the way that Yahushua was dressed, that there was something more than just bread and wine going on. Because Yahushua wore his high priestly garment at the last Passover supper, showing us that it was also a liturgical worship service at which Yahushua officiates at this new covenant. He's the high priest, and he ratifies at this Moedim, this feast of Yahweh. He ratifies the Passover covenant confirming meal. Yahushua wears this same garment at his crucifixion, demonstrating that he was acting as the new covenant high priest, officiating over his own sacrifice, his own offering. This is amazing stuff, because we're told that if we come into this Passover, the first thing that we have to do, we have to cross over. We have got to leave the world, and we have to cross over. It says in Corinthia Aleph, 1 Corinthians 11, verse 25. After the same manner, he also took the Kiddush cup, after he had eaten, saying, this cup of Gelulah is the Brit Chadashah in my dam, blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. And the question you have to ask yourselves is, how often would you drink the Passover cup? And when you answer that question, then you have to go, well, what's this counterfeit that has crept into the church for 2,000 years? And then if you look at history, you connect that, and you have to discard one, and you have to embrace the other. Are you willing to put away the counterfeit and embrace the truth? Or will you cling on to the counterfeit because that's what the goats are doing? You see, this is a time of separation, and that is what is so hard for people. Tradition just tugs at people's heartstrings because tradition brings security. Stepping out in faith brings what? Transformation and change. And we don't like change, and people are afraid to be transformed. But if we are transformed by the word, then we are secure, right? It's amazing. Corinthia Aleph, 1 Corinthians 5, verse 7, it is written, clean out therefore the old chametz, the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you are unleavened. For even Moshiach, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. So let us keep the moed. So right here, the Apostle Paul, Saint Paul, is clearly instructing you in the New Testament what? So let us keep the feast. It's right there. It says nothing about anything pagan, but it says, so if you're in Messiah, you need to keep the Feast of Passover. How do we deal with this verse? We skip over it. We're not going to, but the institutionalized religions for so many years do. But we take the time in the Word and we go, not with the old chametz, neither with the chametz of malice, the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened matzah of sincerity and truth. And we know that Rav Shaliach Shaul, the Apostle Paul, he said, be crucified with Mashiach. It's not possible that you can be crucified with Mashiach unless you go to Passover, because at Passover, that's where you would get to eat his flesh and drink his blood. It's all connected to this day. Passover is a watch night supper, and it's not intended to mimic or to duplicate exactly the Exodus 12 encounter, but it's supposed to memorialize it. And it says, this cup of Gelulah is the Brit Chadashah in my dam, my blood. This is the covenant-confirming blood, the blood-ratifying cup that we partake of in this ordination. So really, Passover, we're going to discover, is an induction into the Melchizedek order. It's an induction into the Melchizedek order. Let's look at a few of the prerequisites for joining the Melchizedek priesthood as the bride. Number one, obedience is the first requirement. Obedience to what? The traditions of men? No, that is the chametz. That's the leaven. Got to get rid of the leaven. It's obedience to the commandments of Yahweh. And people will accuse you and accuse me of legalism. No, legalism is when you make your opinion my burden. That's legalism. Obedience is keeping the commandments of Yahweh. You see, if you change the language, you control the conversation. So when you tell me that I have to come to church on Wednesday night and that I have to have crackers and bread on Sunday to be holy, you are making your opinion my burden. Actually, that's legalism. But when I can go to the Word and say this is the holy commandments of Yahweh, that's called obedience. You see? But if you change the language, you can control the conversation and you can make slaves of men. But this is about becoming free. Freedom in the word of Yahweh. The first prerequisite is obedience. That's the first requirement found in Exodus 19:5. We agree to the proposal. Yahweh proposes, we accept. There is a blood ratification and a covenant-confirming meal. This is the Melchizedek Passover. There is immersion, a setting apart, receiving of the Ruach HaKodesh as he equips us to serve and obey. We become cleansed, the inside out, as Yahusha said, clean the inside of the cup because we agree to obey in this marriage covenant. We are now part of the bride. Passover is that induction to the Melchizedek order. But we don't have to do the crumbly cracker. We don't have to do the crumbly cracker because as we look into the Word and we see bread, are you and I really to believe that the bread symbol adopted by Yahusha at the Last Supper was this matzah crumbly cracker that just disintegrates? Is that really what we're to believe that represents his body? If you follow tradition, yes. But if you look into the Word, you'll see no. So let's look, before we partake of them, of the elements of Passover, beginning with bread. In all of the accounts of the Passover, in the Brit Hadashah, this Greek word pops up, and it's artos. Artos. And it means food or bread, showbread. Food, loaf, meat, victuals, bread as in a raised loaf, or to lift, or to take up, or to raise. It contains yeast, a sourdough starter, but it is not fully risen, leavened, because it would take about 50 days to make a new sourdough lump back in the ancient world. Once they'd eaten all of the leaven, it would take them about 50 days to go and get that sourdough lump again. And how many days is it from Passover to Shavuot? 50 days to be that transformed person, right? We have the counting of the Omer. Isn't that amazing? So the bread, if you look at it and you look at Yahusha, the bread has to have all of the ingredients within itself so that it can raise up. But if you don't believe that Yahusha is the Messiah, and you don't believe in the resurrection, and remember, there were many different sects that didn't believe, then you can create this dried cracker that doesn't have the ingredients within itself ever to raise itself up. But we have to understand whatever bread we partake of, it needs all of the ingredients within itself to raise itself up, except it's pulled out of the oven early, that it is unleavened. Timing is everything. Timing is everything. The related Hebrew words to this Greek word artos are dagan, challah, of course, lechem, matzah, and pot. We find that Yahusha took the artos bread, he blessed it, and he passed it to the Talmudim. Leavened, there's other related words in the Tanakh. We find leaven, this Greek word zume, which means to ferment, leaven, to cause to ferment, or to be soured. And now you can understand, when you tie this all together, why Yahusha's body was offered right before he was about to be raised up. Why was his body offered the soured, fermented wine? Because his body was going to be eventually raised up, not within 50 days, but it was going to expedite it within 3 days. He had all the ingredients within himself to be raised up, even though he was the Passover bread and the Passover lamb and the Passover wine. But they weren't going to wait 50 days, so they added the zume, the pungent zume, the fermenting, because within 3 days he would be raised. You start to see the connections here. It's all within the bread. And it's not a dried matzah cracker, which can never be raised, ever, because it doesn't have the ingredients within itself. So, and we also know that Yahusha, at the Last Supper, the Passover meal, he passed around a sop at his last Passover, that Passover meal. The bread was sopped. You try sopping a crumbly cracker, it would disintegrate. We've tried it before. But we need to have a bread that you can sop, passing around and dipping it, and it is a sop. It will not disintegrate. So looking through the church or the rabbinic prism, we've assumed that it meant a dried crumbly cracker because of traditions. But we know that Yahusha's body represents more than that. Yochanan, John 6:9, we find that there's 5 loaves of barley and 2 fishes. In verse 11, he blessed the loaves and gave them to the shlichim, the apostles, to distribute amongst the multitudes. The bread there is artos. It represents the word, his body, he gave to the disciples to feed his sheep with. He is called, we know, the bread of life. Lechem Chaim, the whole chapter of John right there, John chapter 6, speaks of artos. Artos bread that has all the ingredients within itself to be raised up, not a cracker that can never be raised up. That's why the soured mixture was given to Yahusha as he was crucified, signifying the added ingredient needed for a 3 days and 3 night raising up of the lump, because we're not going to wait 50. That's Shavuot. This is amazing stuff. In sum, as we partake momentarily, the bread we eat at Passover contains a sourdough starter that hasn't yet risen, and you can sop with it. So this has all the ingredients within itself. It's a sourdough starter, yet it was pulled from the oven early, therefore it is unleavened. Think about it. In Shemot, Exodus, they didn't just all sit around and say, hey, let's make unleavened bread tonight before we leave Egypt. Did they? They didn't. They were making bread, regular bread, but they made, it was called the bread of haste. It had all of the ingredients that they were using. And in the ancient world, you can look into Egyptology, and you can look into the ancient tombs of the pharaohs, and there is sourdough starters that is still used today that we use in our bread. That was what they made, but they pulled them out of the ovens because they had to leave in haste. It's right before our eyes, but tradition weighs so heavy on us, doesn't it, that it sends us down all these rabbi trails. So we eat the bread and we drink his blood. And the Passover accounts show that the Mashiach took the bread, the artos, breaking it, his broken body, his word, and he distributes it to the disciples. He imbues us with his word. 1 Corinthians 10:16, it says, the bread we break, is it not a sharing in the body of Messiah? Verse 17, because there is one bread, who are we who are many are one body? For we are all to partake of the one bread. We as Melchizedek priests are told to go to all nations and teach the covenant, whatever I have commanded you. We're to take the word, which is the instructions or the bread of Melchizedek, and we're to go and distribute that bread to others. This is the Melchizedek calling. It's an appointment to teach all things that I have commanded you. It really is the blood covenantal work.